Alrighty, and good morning, everybody. We left off last time talking about self-esteem, and in particular about the life domains in which our evaluation of self-esteem takes place. And we were following that set of life domains through the course, through the life course. We were looking first at the domains that were important in early childhood, then in middle childhood, and we ended last time, I think, with a look at the life domains that were significant contributors to low or high self-esteem in adolescence. I want to move on and finish that consideration today by moving on to the university years, which of course will be more relevant to you than anything else we've talked about. And again, if I put up the areas of significance, we can see that there are, first of all, a lot of duplicates. There are a number of areas that have appeared earlier in our consideration and are still present here in the university years, others which are appearing for the first time. Scholastic competence, of course, because you're still in the school system, if you like, even though post-secondary, is still a very significant contributor to or detractor from self-esteem. We value our ability to succeed scholastically, academically, and so on. Intellectual ability generally, beyond the specifics of learning in the classroom and succeeding in our courses, is also a significant area of self-esteem. Creativity now appears for the first time. The ability to think more broadly, to innovate in terms of many different life areas becomes a significant contributor to our sense of self-esteem. Job competence has been here before, so has athletic competence. It remains, although athletic competence is somewhat diminished in significance compared to the previous few years, but it's nevertheless still there. Physical appearance, of course, as we said, it shows up earliest in life and it remains present until death. Physical appearance is still one of the most significant contributors to, or again, detractors from our personal sense of self-esteem. Peer acceptance, our ability to get along with others is again always going to be here pretty much. It will diminish in significance as we get older, but nevertheless, through adolescence and into the university years and early adulthood, it will remain a very significant factor in determining how we feel about ourselves. Do we get along with others? Do others like us? Can we establish and maintain relationships with others successfully, and so on? We've seen that morality under various terms. I mean, we talked first about behavior, acceptable behavior. What do others expect us to do, and are we in fact living up to those standards of behavior? As we get into adolescence and we begin to form our own personal senses of ethics and morality, it becomes less significant what other people think we ought to be doing and much more significant as to whether or not we are meeting our own internally generated standards of moral and ethical behavior, and that remains true here. So that's why the term morality shows up rather than appropriate behavior. And a new feature, a new aspect of self-esteem makes its appearance here, and that is sense of humor. It's interesting that if you look at, and I've seen this a number of times, there have been on television and elsewhere a number of ads for dating sites online, right? eHarmony and that sort of thing. And in some of those advertisements, individuals who have been looking for love online will talk about, in the ad, about what they're looking for in an ideal mate. And remarkably, over and over and over again, one of the things they will mention is a positive sense of humor. This is the age at which this becomes a much more significant factor in determining our personal sense of self-esteem. Okay, early through middle adulthood, this would be the early 20s through 40s roughly and so on. And here again, we're going to put the whole thing up again. There are several new features that arise here that weren't present in previous parts of our lives. Some are still there. Intelligence, of course, we're now out of school. So scholastic or academic ability will disappear from our sources of self-esteem. We're no longer being evaluated in that area. But general intelligence is still present. Are we able to cognitively manage the tasks that we are set by our work, by our social interactions, and so on? Athletic competence, of course, physical appearance is still here. Athletic competence has diminished quite dramatically by this time because, by and large, with few exceptions, we are not participating in athletically themed contests of any sort. We may belong to a softball league or a hockey league and so on, and that's where this would become significant, but it's not going to be a major contributor to our sources of self-esteem in this age range. Physical appearance, of course, is still there. Sociability now is the word we're going to use rather than peer acceptance. Peer acceptance is what we were talking about previously. How well are we able to get along with others of our own age, others of our own class, if you like? And this will remain true, although in later years it will diminish in significance. It will remain true right till the end of life. Morality is still there, sense of humor is still there. And now, though, we're adding several other potential sources of contribution to self-esteem, and these have to do with our role as a family member, our role as a part of a family, spouse, children, perhaps even an extended family with grandparents or whatever else is involved. And so we're now beginning to evaluate ourselves and be evaluated by others in terms of our ability to maintain an appropriate level of cohesion in the household, nurturance with respect both to our spouse, but more particularly to our children. Are we caring for them appropriately? Are we a good provider? Have we able to maintain a standard of living for our family that is appropriate to what our expectations and the expectations of those around us? And that's where that comes in. Right? Household management, adequacy as a provider. So now we're being judged on family matters in addition to work-related matters and in personal characteristics as well. So that's through middle adulthood. Any questions or comments here, by the way? Okay. Late adulthood, we're now looking at 40 plus. It's not really clear exactly where this should begin. Typically, we'd argue that it ends perhaps with death. Oh, yes, go ahead. Yes. Yeah, it's more about, are we providing appropriate levels of nurturance for those around us? And in particular, of course, that would be referring to our children, if any, right? Any other questions? Okay. All right, so late adulthood. Again, we see very much the same characteristics being important to self-esteem that we saw in middle adulthood. Cognitive abilities, job competence, physical appearance, again, still there, relationships or sociability, morality, all of this stuff. Now we add leisure activities. This has not appeared before. We've been engaged in leisure activities at earlier stages of life, certainly from early adulthood through middle adulthood, if not before. But now, of course, this includes retirement years. And so for individuals who are in or approaching retirement, the importance of non-work-related, non-job-related activities begins to rise in significance, and that's why we see leisure activities. Do we have sources of hobbies or outside interests, activities that we can engage in when we're not engaged in our career path and so on? And are they satisfying to us? Are we competent in those areas? If we're members of some sort of golf league in our retirement community, are we doing well as a golfer, and so on and so forth? And then again, we still have household management and provisions for the family, but now we get health status and mortality added. This is really typically the first period of life where we may have significant concerns about our health, right? Most of the sorts of disorders that, with few exceptions, that people experience begin to happen in middle to late adulthood, and of course beyond that in the retirement years. My own arthritis, for example, would be a classic example of this sort of thing. And there are many other things. Cancers often attack late in life as well, and so on. And then by this time we're becoming aware that there is less time ahead of us than there was behind us. That most of our life, the bulk of our life, is in fact over, and we have to start thinking about the end times and what will happen when we eventually pass away. And so there were concerns raised about the relationship of our current health status to potential risks for early death and so on and so forth. And my wife, who has a long time experience dealing with the elderly in nursing homes and so on in the healthcare system, says that this is typically the way in a nursing home or a retirement home, people rate each other in terms of their health. People with higher levels of positive health have a higher status in the nursing home than those who have significant health issues and so on. So this becomes a very significant part of our own self-esteem, because we recognize that others are rating us in terms of our health status, in terms of how they see us as a valued individual and so on. Okay, any questions about any of that or comments? Okie dokie. Now I want to come back to an issue that I addressed last time and kind of summarize this. We talked about differences in males versus females in terms of self-esteem development. I had said that the standard model, which is being modified these days, suggests that females beginning in adolescence tend to have somewhat lower self-esteem than males. And that change in self-esteem from positive perhaps to negative, or from more positive to less positive, tends to begin occurring early in adolescence for females. For males, very often, the path is opposite. That is, they tend to improve or increase their self-esteem during adolescence. And I suggested that one reason for that fairly significant finding is that it has to do with the physical appearance and puberty, in that females tend to be, as they go through puberty, they tend to deviate from, their body development tends to deviate from what is considered the beauty standard in Western culture. Whereas males tend to get closer to the societally approved standard for physical appearance and attractiveness in adult males as they go through puberty. Their shoulders broaden, musculature increases, and so on. For females, there's a larger level of fat deposition and so on, other sorts of things that are not typically considered part of the norm for standards of female beauty, at least up until recently. As I suggested, there is a significant movement afoot to try and alter that perception so that there's a more realistic relationship between actual female body development and the standards of physical beauty that we hold females to. Anyway, so I just wanted to review some of this. Now, we talked about two foundations of self-esteem, two sources of self-esteem, two types of self-esteem. You can say what you will about them. One of those is competence. That is, our self-esteem is based in large part, especially here in the West, on our ability to achieve things, to do things, whether it's academically, athletically, or in other ways, at the job level. Are we successful at the things we attempt to achieve in any or all of these areas of life? And then secondly, there's worthiness-based self-esteem. The notion that quite apart from what we have achieved, quite apart from our ratio of successes to failures, as a human being, we are worthy of respect and attention and esteem from others. Right? Simply being a valued individual regardless of one's actual achievements. Now, if we look at the bases of male versus female self-esteem, we find both of those things are present. Females and males are both interested in, concerned with, evaluated on, and evaluating themselves on their personal worthiness and on their successes versus failures. But we do see a difference in the weighting, if you like, of those two components of self-esteem. For females, it seems that their self-esteem is much more based on worthiness than on competence. Less on what they are able to do and achieve and their skills, and more on their social relationships, more on their acceptance by others, more on their valuing by others. females are generally more social and bingo. All right. All righty. Okay. So as I said, females tend to weight their sense of self-esteem more towards the worthiness side of the spectrum and less towards the achievement, accomplishments, success versus failures side of things. Males go the other way. Females, because, as I mentioned, experience that drop in self-esteem in adolescence, largely because of changes in appearance that move them away from the socially approved standard of female adult beauty. Now, for male, self-esteem is much, much, much more dependent on competence, on skill, on the ability to accomplish things, and less on worthiness, less on their social interactions, the success or failure of their social interactions with others, less on their acceptance by others, more on what they can personally achieve. Right? And they tend to have and so their sense of self-esteem is more related to their ability to be an independent agent or operator in the environment, to accomplish things on their own, to be autonomous, and to show a relatively muted level of emotional reactivity to anything that happens around them. Right? This is the standard to which we typically hold males. Males are not supposed to, in our society, show strong levels of either positive, but especially not negative emotion, not fear, not anger, not anxiety, and so on. And this is one of the reasons that we see far fewer males in clinical psychological settings than females, because males simply won't go to seek treatment. They'd rather deal with it on their own because they consider psychological issues to be signs of weakness, male weakness, and they can't have any of that. Okay. Any questions or comments about any of this? This, of course, is part of our standard stereotype of how males and females are. It happens to have more than a grain of truth associated with it, as the literature indicates. Okay. And I mentioned that before. Now, the ways in which we develop, manage, and maintain our self-esteem very much depends on what aspects of self-esteem or competence or worthiness we value personally, and which the society tends to value as well. Different individuals, well, societies in general, especially when we compare, for example, individualist societies like Europe and North America to collectivist societies like most of Asia, tend to have different values for what it is that self-esteem should be based on. Here in the West, self-esteem is much more largely based on individual achievement, on individual success, whereas in collectivist, mostly Asian societies, it is much more heavily based on our ability to contribute to the welfare of others around us, as we've seen. Okay. Uh, another gradation along which we see differences in values has to do with socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status is a term that generally is seen to combine two aspects of an individual's experience. One is their education, and the second is their income. Those two things, of course, are highly correlated. Individuals with higher levels of education tend to have significantly higher incomes than those with lower levels of education, with very few exceptions. So SES is a kind of a shorthand for this combination of education and income. And we can see some fairly substantial differences in values between those of low and those of high socioeconomic status. If you look at, for example, individuals who are highly educated and have high incomes, they tend to value less physical accomplishments. They're less likely to value manual skills, more likely to value intellectual ones, more likely to value understanding. They're less likely to value strength, for example, over various kinds of intellectual understanding. Well, let me back this up. No, I'll go ahead. I remember a case, I may have mentioned it to you when we were discussing this issue in personality. There was a young man that arrived at McMaster 25, 30 years ago from a East End blue-collar family. His family, going back 2 or 3 generations, had been manual laborers. More recently, they had been workers at the steel plants, either Stelco or Dofasco, I don't remember which. And that's what they valued. They had reasonably good incomes, but they had very specific manual skills, things they could do with their hands. They were builders, they were creators, they were, and so on and so forth. They placed a very, very, very much lower value on intellectual, cognitive skills. And yet this young man, that's where he's shown. That's where his strengths were. He's a very, very bright guy, very thoughtful, able to assimilate and understand various kinds of information and to make sense out of it and apply it to his own life circumstances. So instead of seeking a job in the steel mills, which all of his family essentially argued that he should, he came to McMaster to earn an undergraduate degree, which he did. But against all of the pressures from his family. Why are you wasting your time and money doing something that's not going to get you a good paying job? Why not just go to the mill and get a job at Stelco or Dofasco or whatever else? And he went through this for 4 solid years as an undergraduate. He was a very successful undergraduate, and he was able to gain admittance to a master's program here as well. But by that time, and of course the costs were somewhat higher, as it turned out for him, in the master's program, and by that time the pressures from his family were unrelenting. And so after about a year in the master's program, he dropped out and disappeared, right? Even though he was doing well academically. Right? His values, his achievements, his accomplishments were not in an area valued by his family, by that part of society, that socioeconomic group from which he had come. Right? And we see this happening a lot in the world. Okay. Apart from social values, and of course there are generic social values as well from the culture in general. And then there are those from the various levels of socioeconomic status as well. And equally, and sometimes more significant, there are the values that we have set for ourselves, our personal values. Now, these would be represented in the personality data we talked about in the personal constructs of Van Doren and Michel. And of course, a lot of these values will come down from our parents. There are parents who's based on their own life experiences and based on their socioeconomic status will place a very, very high value on educational attainment. Others who will place a much higher value on achieving a good job and learning manual skills, carpentry, mechanical work, whatever it happens to be. Right? And we will, of course, in addition to being influenced by our social values, our socioeconomic status values, our parental values, we will develop values of our own. And they typically will align with what we see to be our strengths. That is, of course, and sensibly, we will value as sources of self-esteem those things at which we are good, and place a much lesser value, even a low value, on things that we do not do well, right? And so all of these things together in various combinations lead to the set of life areas on which we base our self-esteem. It can be quite a complex derivation, as you can imagine, especially if your skills are different from the ones that your parents, your family, your socioeconomic group tends to value. Like that young man I mentioned, whose skills were in the intellectual, cognitive realm, whereas all of his relatives and most of the people he knew in that blue-collar neighborhood valued manual skills, physical skills, strength, and so on. Things which he may have had, but which were not prominent in his set of abilities and so on. Okay, any questions or comments about any of that? All righty. I want to take a look now at a very influential model of individual self-esteem that was created and publicized by a man named Christopher Maruk, M-R-U-K. I've quoted him before, I think. He is one of the leading theorists and researchers in the area of self-esteem, and has been for a long time. He has a classic book out on self-esteem, which in fact just came out in a new edition just a few months ago, I think. I haven't yet got it. But nevertheless, it builds on a lengthy career working in this area. And he begins with the distinction, which he was one of the first to make, as a matter of fact, between the two sources, the two foundations of self-esteem. And that is personal worth or value, quite apart from achievements or accomplishments, versus successes and failures, accomplishments and achievements. Competence-based self-esteem. Do you base your self-esteem largely on what you are able to do versus worthiness-based self-esteem? Do you base your self-esteem or rate yourself more highly in your general value as an individual? And so he says, look, we can see this as a 2-by-2 matrix here, where if we can rate ourselves in competence from a really incompetent, -10, all the way up to, let's say, very competent, +10. We can rate ourselves in worthiness, again, from -10, really unworthy and worthless, to +10, very worthy and valuable, and so on. And we can, depending on how we value ourselves on each of these dimensions, competence and worthiness, we fall in one of the 4 quadrants, one of the 4 corners of this diagram, right? Let's put that diagram up. Whoop. Okay. And let's back that up. So he gives names to each of these quadrants. We'll start with the lower left-hand quadrant, where individuals rate themselves as worthless, if you like, very lacking in worthiness, and low in competence as well. And this is what he calls classical low self-esteem. Individuals who would rate themselves in this quadrant. I'm a worthless individual, I have no value to others or society, I'm unlovable, and I lack skills, my life is full of failures, and so on. These are individuals who very typically, though not always, would meet the criterion for some mental disorder in the DSM. The typical one that they would meet, of course, is major depressive disorder. This is a classic description of an individual with major depressive disorder. They're worthless, they're valueless, their life is full of failure, and so on and so forth, at least as they see it. It may not be true, but it does not matter. What matters is your perception of things as they are. We also see individuals with eating disorders down here, some anxiety disorders, a few personality disorders, but by and large, major depression is what we see here. Now, so these are individuals who are extremely sensitive to any challenge to their self-esteem. They tend to downplay their own successes or even ignore them, right? They emphasize or tend to remember their failures instead. This is one of the ways in which cognitive behavioral therapy tries to help deal with this, is by asking them to actually look at the evidence. What is the evidence that you are a colossal failure in life? What is the counter evidence suggesting that you have had successes, and so on and so forth? So these are individuals very sensitive to any sort of social slight, any sort of failure. They ignore their successes and, in general, take no risks, and so on and so forth. Classic low self-esteem. In the top left-hand quadrant, we have individuals who rate themselves very, 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 very highly in worthiness, but rate themselves very low in competence. And this Maruk calls narcissistic self-esteem, because the individual often, in the extreme, sees themselves as of extreme personal value and worth, quite apart from any presence or absence of achievements. And of course, that form of extreme self-love is what we mean by narcissism. Right? So these are individuals who are constantly craving validation from others. They need for others to see them positively. That's how they judge their self-worth. That's how they judge their worthiness. They don't need to have personal successes. They downplay their failures to begin with. But what they really need is interpersonal validation. They need for others to show signs of caring, love, affection, and so on. They will do almost, in the extreme cases, they will do almost anything to get this. They will debase and demean themselves. They show very high levels. They can show very high levels of dependence. They can use sexuality in order to try and gain the affection, attention, and worth of others, and so on. Right? Very sensitive to any sort of social slights. They try to avoid any kind of conflict, interpersonal conflict, which might lead others to evaluate them negatively. They stay out of trouble as much as they can interpersonally. And you can imagine that this leads to some, low risk-taking behavior. They won't try anything where they might be a social failure. Right? They need to maintain their sense of personal status at virtually all costs. Right? And they may do anything. They may pretend to be, well, there are classic cases of individuals who pretended to be the offspring of famous individuals in order to get others to like them and value them as worthwhile. Right? Anything to get others to give you positive value, because it's on that sense of personal worth that your entire set of self-esteem evaluations are based. You can't fall back on competence. You can't say, well, it doesn't matter so much whether everybody likes me, because I am a competent individual in this, that, or the other area of life, because these are individuals who rate themselves extremely low in competence. They just have that one leg to stand on with respect to self-esteem, and so they protect it vigorously. Any way they can to avoid negative interpersonal interactions, to avoid negative relationships with others. And of course, that means they don't stand up for themselves, they don't assert themselves. They're very often very demure in their relationships with others. We move into the lower right-hand corner, which Maruk calls antisocial self-esteem. This characterizes individuals, or describes individuals who have a very, very high level of rating themselves in terms of success and failure, but rate themselves very low in worthiness. Now, before I describe this, one of the aspects of the model that is problematic is that Maruk is talking about how people actually see themselves in terms of competence, how they see themselves in terms of personal worth or value. He does not, in this model, talk a great deal about how they decide which of these two ways of evaluating themselves is more important. You could conceivably be in this lower right-hand corner, seeing yourself as extremely competent but not liked by others, and you don't care because you don't value being liked by others to a great degree. This would describe, for example, Machiavellians, personality characteristic we talk about, where people are manipulative. They would rather be feared and hated, but respected rather than loved, right? Because worthiness is not their concern. Their concern is success in life. And again, they will very often, or I won't say typically, do almost anything to achieve this. In the extreme cases, they'll ignore the law, they'll ignore rules, they'll ignore social norms, they'll stab people in the back, they'll climb over others, denigrate those above them so they can make their way up in the world so that they will have personal success. One could argue that certain areas of life are heavily populated by people in this quadrant. Politics might be one of those areas, where there are individuals who would seemingly do anything, say anything, to make sure they achieve the kinds of goals and successes that they believe are important in their own self-esteem. I'm not going to name any names here, but I'm sure you can think of people, at least in the U.S. political system, because of course that's receiving about as much publicity here as Canadian politics is. You can think of people who would fit this description very easily. Well, I will name one. Roger Stone, the guy who was just sentenced to 3 years for lying to Congress and a few other things. He strikes me as someone who might fall in this quadrant. I don't care if people like me. I just want to be successful at the things I do in the political realm and so on. Okay, so that's antisocial self-esteem. Any comments or questions about that? And finally, in the upper right quadrant, we have what Maruk calls authentic self-esteem. This is a description of individuals who rate themselves highly in personal worth and value, and also rate themselves highly in competence and skill and ability and success. And this is the sort of self-esteem that Maruk and many others in the field believe is the only really valuable form of self-esteem. The only form of self-esteem that both maximizes our personal achievements and also maximizes our ability to get along with others. And we'll talk a bit more about authentic self-esteem in just a minute. Maruk also further subdivides these quadrants into inner quadrants. I'm not going to talk about them. I'll just show you the names here. This is individuals who are not extreme on either quadrant, right? So instead of -10 for classical low self-esteem, you'd have -5 for negativistic low self-esteem. So they're essentially milder versions of the extremes here. Milder versions of antisocial self-esteem is achievement-centered self-esteem, and so on and so forth. Okay. We want, of course, always to be up in the upper right-hand quadrant, which he describes as medium to authentic self-esteem. But I'm not going to talk about the qualities of those individuals, just the main quadrants. Okay, any questions or comments here? Yeah. But very much
basically wants to be loved by others?
Typically, they don't care very much about the worthiness dimension because they already rate themselves low on it and don't expect that is going to change. They would rather be successful than be liked, right? One of the again, I pick politics because it's notorious for the number of people who are striving to achieve things without worrying about how they get there. You may have heard this. There's a famous saying in Washington among legislators there. It says, and it goes like this: if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog, right? Because nobody is going to be your friend. They're all they're all out to maximize their own successes and so on and so forth, and they will walk right over you to do that, right? And again, as I said, the news has been full of what I would consider examples of exactly that behavior from members of the U.S. government. Anyway, okay, any other comments or questions here? Okay. I don't know why I've got 2 copies of this. There we go. All right. So let's stick with, of course, this is a positive psychology course. We're not going to focus on anything but the upper right-hand quadrant, that authentic or positive self-esteem. And Maruk and others who work in the field argue that, look, there are a number of values, reasons that we would want to be in that upper quadrant. One of them has to do with what what self-esteem does for us in times of trouble, right? When things go wrong, when we have problems, self-esteem buffers us against the extremes of negative emotions that we might otherwise experience. We can fall back on our notion that we are a valued individual, we are a competent individual, even though we may have experienced a failure here. Even though we may have been rebuffed by a friend or a former friend, right? This is not going to destroy our personal sense of worth because we have other values to fall back on and so on and so forth. So it's a buffer against stress, anxiety, and depression and so on. Individuals up in this quadrant are also, because they have this very strong foundation of positive self-evaluation, whether based both on worthiness and on competence, they tend to take more risks. They're willing to try more new things, right? And of course, one of the things that we know about growth choices is that they're risky. And so the argument here is that individuals with high self-esteem are much more likely to make those sorts of growth choices. And we'll come back to that issue a little later on. And we can see that individuals with high self-esteem have a number of personal qualities that we would value. They tend to be seen positively by others. They seem to have to be in a better mood most of the time. It's related to both life satisfaction and personal happiness. And it's associated with a number of different characteristics. In general, extroverts, compared with introverts, tend to have higher levels of self-esteem. It's also associated with relationship satisfaction. Individuals with high self-esteem tend to be more satisfied with any of the relationships they belong to. Family relationships in particular, marriages, relationships with their kids, whatever it happens to be. They tend to be more satisfied with that. Now, that's a correlational relationship. We don't know that having high self-esteem contributes to that satisfaction. It may be that that satisfaction contributes to high self-esteem, right? We only know that those two things are related. When we first started talking about self-esteem, I said that it's important in the academic realm, has been recognized for 25 or 30 years at least. And schools beginning even in grade 1 or even kindergarten over the last 20 plus years or so have begun to shift their focus not away from academic achievement, but to bring in more aspects of self-esteem development and management, because they recognize that academic achievement is very highly correlated with an individual's sense of personal self-esteem. Right? We know that dropout rates are higher for people with low self-esteem. GPAs and grade point averages are lower for people with low self-esteem, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so forth. Right? And so there's been some, as I said, some considerable emphasis on trying to maintain or improve the self-esteem of students at various levels in order to hopefully improve the quality of their educational outcomes. It's also the case that this is one of the reasons that there's a lot of participation awards these days that never used to exist. When I was growing up, you had a winner, you had a second place person, a third place person, everybody else got nothing. Now you get participation awards, right? If you're there, if you show up, you get a trophy or a ribbon or something. And of course, the purpose of this, again, is self-esteem building. You are a person of worth, value, and accomplishment, even just for being here, right? And of course, we recognize that sort of value. It's an honor just to compete, they say. And yes, in many respects, that's true. It's also the case, let me just put one more up. It's also the case that high levels of self-esteem are associated positively with strong and strongly held personal, moral, and ethical values. People with high self-esteem tend to hold themselves to a stricter standard of behavior. They're less likely to cheat, less likely to steal, less likely to do anything that violates common and personally accepted moral standards. Again, it's not perfectly clear why that is the case, whether it's the high self-esteem that leads to the high moral standards and their achievement, or whether the high moral standards lead the person to feel better about themselves and therefore and so on. So we're not really sure. There is also some evidence, there's not a lot of studies in this area. We've talked about this before. When we talked about, for example, mindfulness, we talked about the relationship between mindfulness and the functioning of the immune system. We saw that at least a number of studies have suggested that individuals who practice mindfulness meditation have immune systems that are more efficient, more effective, more responsive to attack from viral and other sorts of external invaders. There is similar evidence for individuals with high self-esteem. There are several studies suggesting that high self-esteem is associated with a more efficient and more effectively functioning immune system. Now, we do know, I mean, we can go the other way very clearly. If you look at individuals who are in the lower left-hand quadrant of that Maruk diagram, the classical low self-esteem, we know that virtually every aspect of their physical functioning is negatively impacted by, or is negative. A negative level of functioning is associated with low self-esteem. So individuals who have low self-esteem tend not to have efficient immune systems, and they tend to have more allergies. There's a whole raft of things that go along with low self-esteem. We don't know why that relationship exists, whether or not the low self-esteem contributes to the poor or organic functioning of the body, or whether some other relationship is involved. But again, it looks at also that at the other side of on the coin, when we look at individuals with high self-esteem, we tend to see more positive physiological functioning in the individual, at least in this case, with respect to the immune system. There are other studies suggesting other positive physiological benefits associated with high self-esteem. I didn't mention them because the literature is not thick on the ground in those areas yet. People will still be looking at that, I'm sure. But I don't feel confident in sharing the conclusions at this point with you, because I'm not sure they're going to hold up under further scrutiny. But the direction of the results does suggest, again, that positive self-esteem has positive value, not just psychologically, but physiologically as well. Okay, any comments or questions at this point then? All right, yeah, well, okay, yeah, I would do one more slide. Now, there are 3 or 4 characteristics we see in authentic self-esteem, that top right-hand quadrant. One of them is stability. One of the things that characterizes the extreme quadrants, apart from authentic self-esteem, is fluctuation. There is much more variability in one's sense of self-esteem at the other corners. In authentic self-esteem, because you have this double buffer, you have the worthiness component, you have the competence component, there's much less fluctuation and variation from day to day, from week to week, in one's sense of self-esteem. It also, one of the interesting features of high self-esteem has to do with our attitude about ourselves. I don't want to get too deeply into this. I don't imagine you've taken my attitudes and persuasion course, but those of you who might have will be familiar with explicit and implicit measures of attitudes. An explicit measure of attitude is, how do you feel about yourself? That's an explicit question, right? I am asking you directly to answer the question, how do you evaluate yourself? There are implicit measures of attitudes about anything, including self-esteem, and they don't involve asking the person directly how they feel about X or Y or their self-esteem. It involves response time measures, and I'm not going to detail how this works, in which you are indirectly assessing the individual's evaluation of something, themselves in this case, by looking at how rapidly they respond to the association between positive words, for example, and their name, and negative words and their name, and so on. And in many, 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 many areas of evaluation, there is an inconsistency between the attitude we detect or infer from implicit measures and the attitude we detect from explicit measures. We see this in particular, for example, with respect to racial prejudice and bias. Individuals who consciously and explicitly say, I am not a racist, I do not have any racial bias, and so on. If you look at their implicit measures of attitudes towards various racial groups, you see bias. You see, for example, and this is the classic finding in the U.S., they typically look, of course, at black-white relationships. In the U.S., you'll have individuals say, no, I'm not a racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, says Donald Trump, for example. Right? I'm the least racist person you're ever going to meet. But you look at their implicit measures, and you see they're much quicker to associate negative words with images, for example, of black people than they are with images or names of white people, suggesting the presence of prejudice at some maybe unconscious level of analysis. And what we see with respect to high self-esteem is a consistency between those. We don't see a difference between the explicit and implicit measures of self-esteem. They both agree. All right, we'll leave that here and finish this up next time and move on. We'll see you then.